So before we get started in some of the content, we're going to throw a couple short games in here into the mix. So learn a little bit about some sustainability. So I'm going to choose somebody here in the audience to guess which one of these has more emissions. A cup of coffee, and you're going to win a $50 Starbucks gift card. A cup of coffee, the actual coffee you're drinking, or the cup itself, like the paper cup. So let me choose somebody, that you're front and center on the cell phone, calling them out in the glasses. Oh, got you calling out on the cell phone. Uh-oh. What would you guess? Which one's more carbon emissions? All right, he's going with the paper cup. All right, we'll see if he's right. No, it's actually the coffee itself. So a lot of what goes into that is, you think about the farming, the transportation, the waste, et cetera, actually generates more than some of the paper cups, which a lot can be recycled. So some other things to point out, how can you do this? So you can use French press at home. We all have the automated coffee machines, et cetera. You can do French presses manually. You could reusable cups when you take them to Starbucks. They do a lot of those programs now. So some ways to invest there. So anyway, we're still going to give you the gift card as a consolation. I'll give it to Mandy. But with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Justin to jump in there a little bit on the ESG overview.
All right, so here's what we're not going to do today. We're not going to try to influence you that climate change is real, that you should care more or less about it. This is not like an Al Gore presentation. What we're going to talk about today is why this is relevant to every company, regardless of what you think about climate change. Tapping into all the different stakeholders that impact the companies we work with, from investors to lenders to the regulators, that can truly influence our top line, right? When we think about customers, et cetera, to our bottom line and our costs, to the amount of risk profile we have relative to all the regulation that's happening in the space. So this is not an emotional presentation. This is to try to give context as to why this stuff matters to every business. And then as a little bit of teaser, why you, and not to paint a broad brush, but generally, as Brad mentioned, right, this is a technology conference. This is a data science conference. This is about big solutions in those good veins. That is what's been missing in this space. And as we've gone from historical ESG being kind of a front office strategy, brand, put some investments, the amount of data and quality and information that we need to make decisions in the future and to be compliant with regulations has dramatically gone up. So I will hypothesize that this group will play a big role, and your peers within your companies will be playing a huge role in this space in the near future if you're not already. So we're super excited to talk about that. All right, first of all, ESG, there gets a bad rap, a good rap, depending on if you're in a red state, a blue state. This was initially an investing strategy, right? Let's look beyond the financials in terms of how we make decisions about companies. In the acronym STUCK, it was used to capture, and still is, a litany of issues. Some of these issues are related and correlated, and some of them are not. The challenge is when you conflate all of these issues under the acronym ESG. What is most important for most of your companies is to identify which issues are most material. Right? So if I think about environment, climate is a big one, and more specifically, carbon emissions. That's the 80-pound gorilla. This is where a lot of the regulatory reporting is on. When you think about climate change, it's usually CO2 or carbon equivalents in the atmosphere. That's a lot of the scrutiny. That's what we're now having to report, et cetera. So there's other things in here, environment from water consumption, et cetera, but we're going to zone in a little bit about carbon because of its disproportionate impact for most companies. When you get into social, there's a lot of issues. Depending on your type of company, certain issues may be more important than others. We're a services company. People are our asset at PwC. Diversity and inclusion is one of our most important issues. If you're developing shoes offshore, working conditions might be the most important social issue for you, right? So these issues are not all equal depending on the company. And then you get into governance. How do we manage our company? What transparency do we have into our tax policies and those types of things? So a lot of issues, not saying that they're all equally important, and they're certainly not equally important within every company. The key is, what does your company care most about? Climate and carbon is certainly a big one. I would say 90% of companies have to do something material in, so we'll spend a lot of time today using that as an example. All right, I've alluded to this earlier, and this is the take all the emotion out of it. I'm operating a company. These are the stakeholders that are becoming more and more important in this space. So investors. And this is interesting. A lot of investors, and we work with PE companies, they do diligence now around ESG, right? They want to understand the risks of the company and exposures in this space. What's also interesting is if you look at all the cost cutting that's been happening, the last couple of years, even in Silicon Valley and in the tech sector, but certainly across the country, investors are also saying, yes, we like ESG, we like a lot of those issues on the prior page, but what is this costing us? This is not a blank check to go fix, reduce our emissions to zero if it costs us viability within our company. Again, we'll keep coming back to the theme of data. It's becoming more and more data to get ROI for these companies. There's activists, employees at a lot of companies. We do a lot of surveys, like these are important issues. Companies are voting, or your employees are voting with their feet, the types of companies they work for. We've certainly been reports about exodus from some companies because certain issues, or traction from some others. Regulators I'm going to hit, so I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. Lenders. There are loan covenants tied to certain ESG goals. There is access to different or preferred interest rates tied to different ESG goals and achievement of those goals. There's green bonds and things where companies are announcing billions of dollars of financing that they're getting solely because their investments are meeting certain criteria. So all of these things become really more important, including consumers. And again, the question is, can consumers actually move, and will they choose different companies based on certain conditions around ESG? In a lot of industries, the answer is yes. So I'm going to kind of quickly hit some of these things. But this is important for us to know, right, within IT functions, with data science functions, data operations functions on the why. I think sometimes our functions in our companies come to us and say, I need this data, I need it yesterday, without really articulating the business case. Again, even if we are agnostic to our own feelings about whether the climate's changing or how fast, this stuff is hitting companies, and you have to be compliant with regulation, right? I guarantee every one of your companies files financial statements, assuming they're a public company. If they're a private company, you're probably filing to get access to certain loans and things from banks, et cetera. But we've now got, we've had European jurisdictions coming out with required disclosures in this space in much more detail, specifically around those carbon emissions. We had the SEC announce proposals around carbon emissions that are now kind of going through feedback and then comment, and we expect to be finalized. Why does that matter? If I were a company, like a lot of your companies, probably once a year put out a sustainability report, probably sometime in the summer. They got 6 months to do it, not under audit. Now, my officers, under the same penalties that they can get for having materially misstated financial statements, can go to jail if we're materially misstating our impacts on emissions and things. Why is this getting CC'd attention? It's because of that. Also, think about all the companies that made, a lot of your companies have made bold goals around going net zero, reducing climate emissions, et cetera. Now I've got to provide a lot more transparency under the subject of regulatory scrutiny as to how I'm actually achieving those goals. Well, what if I provided these goals without a lot of data on how I was going to get there? That's the case most companies are in. So there's this little bit of, is the tide going away, and people aren't wearing the swimsuits, as for an analogy. I mean, this will provide more spotlight and transparency into all the goals we've made and how we're achieving those. The other side of the coin, there's been a lot of incentives that have come out recently. Right? The IRS has some incredible incentive, multi-billion dollars. In the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually wasn't a great name for it given all the climate incentives. What does this mean? This means that your companies that have made a bunch of investments or plans to take on a bunch of projects to achieve carbon emissions goals, or called decarbonization, probably didn't factor in all these incentives and taxes. Now you have all these different incentives and taxes that can materially change the decisions that we make about when we do certain projects, how we do it, and what type and what geography we do them in. So if you think about the needs to be compliant here and not be embarrassed because our data doesn't ultimately support what we've been saying for the last few years, or you think about trying to make sure from a cash flow perspective we're taking advantage of material credits, we've got to have really good data for this. I won't go into this, but just note that if your stakeholders are asking for a lot of data, there's multiple standards that have been in the space describing what type of information we need to report, the type of metadata that we need to capture. these things are starting to align, and there's at least enough commonality that companies can get moving. So we're not paralyzed because of the flux here. Just know this is a dynamic space, and the best answer is what is the least common denominator amongst all the regulators, amongst all the standards that are going to be able to allow my companies to provide the data they need in the future. And a lot of companies are not in that position right now. Okay, Brad, I'm going to get it back to you because I think it went a little bit long. But this is the evolution your companies are going to go through really fast, or need to go through in order to manage risk and to be able to take advantage of all the opportunities in the market around ESG and climate, et cetera. Many companies are on level 1, level 2. They are compliant with the limited regulations, putting out a sustainability report. Things are localized. It's all spreadsheets. How we use certain estimates for certain emissions where we don't have the data, generally not consistent across the world, et cetera. Where we need to get really fast, so 10K, that's my annual financial statement for a public company, we got to get here. And if I have inconsistent policies, if I say, hey, if I have an HR statement that says, hey, we are the greenest X company in the world, and then my financials don't back that up, that's going to be trouble. If I've made a commitment to a lender that I'm meeting certain covenants, and then I go here under the penalty of audit, and it shows that I'm not, that's going to be trouble. So I got to get quickly compliant. I got to have good policies. I have to have centralized data, which Brad's going to take us into, to be able to manage all the needs. And I need to be able to do it quick. If you think about financial reporting, we've had decades to build up ERP systems, cloud data platforms, et cetera. And we iterated. Now we've got a new set of rules around an all new type of data, right? Carbon emissions, which our companies are not used to generating quickly. There's probably a small team that does a sustainability report. This is going to become another 80-pound gorilla, we think, for most organizations. You guys are going to need to be key parts of that for your organization and the functions that you represent. And Brad's going to get into that a little bit more.
Cool. Thanks, Justin. All right, quick break again. Next guessing game here. We all traveled probably to get here, or at least you took a car or an Uber, even if you're local. So question on which is more emissions, driving a car all the way from New York to this location, or taking a short flight from LA in economy? So, all right, we got driving down here. And correct. Driving flying is pretty carbon emitting. So again, some other things you can do. Electric vehicles. One interesting part of that is charge your electric vehicle with fuel like solar panel that is clean. So depending, there's nuances in that. And then some of you may see that the airlines actually have credits where you can contribute $5 to help making them, reduce. Sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. The green box is on the wrong one. Sorry, apologize for that. So we got the correct answer. So. All
right, $50 for this guy too.
Yes. So I think as Justin talked about the maturity curve, it's kind of like, why can't companies do that now? Like, what are the challenges around getting there? Why isn't everybody a leader? And so, Justin, we want to highlight a few of these things before we go into some of the solutions as to the barriers for companies becoming more carbon
We
friendly.
talked about all the stakeholders to manage, and they need data at different levels for different purposes. Viability. We have a lot of companies that are cost cutting, et cetera, yet I need to I've made these commitments, I need to get there. How do I do that? How do I do that with ROI, considering all the things we talked about? Big data analytics exercise. Organization and change management. To actually come up with the plan and then execute that through all levels of supply chain operations, procurement, C-suite, back office. There's a lot of coordination that needs to happen. And then the data. Again, the rest of this presentation is going to be on the data. The data is not easy to collect. It's not just sitting in systems. I got to work with my energy providers. I need to make estimates where it doesn't exist. And this data, it's hard to monitor, right? Even if my energy company says this stuff. So the volume of data that I need to manage and monitor and put controls over is really significant. And there's now a ton of vendors in this space. I mean, by the month, you'll see new vendors that have some role in the ecosystem around computing carbon, et cetera. What we'll hint at later, again, going back to the role and the reason we're up here at the Google conference is, despite all the different vendors and all the sources, there is a big need for something in the middle, right, to manage all this. And that's where we're seeing a lot of companies turn here.
So as we look at this, kind of a recap of the stakeholders, I think one important aspect of this is looking stakeholder and business value first. I think if anybody's been involved in the past couple decades of building data platforms, there's been a lot of build it and they will come. And so it's important that you avoid that here as well, and don't just dump a bunch of data into, quote, an ESG data lake and then expect your organization is going to just somehow benefit from it. So it's important to work from this vantage point across what do your customers need, what do regulators need, what are lenders requiring, and focus on that and incrementally build your data, AI, reporting, intelligence capabilities around that maturity. Because if you try to mature it all at once in this big builder, they will come, inevitably your program will stall, lose funding, lose interest, and not be very effective.
And maybe just one comment on that. The reason we always try to highlight all these stakeholders, some of the mistakes companies have made is saying, we're just going to build out the data model for kind of one set of most imminent needs. And if that data model, as you guys know, right, if that data model is not at the right level of detail for some other need or later, it's a lot harder to go back into our ERP systems, our subledger systems, unwind that and add more detail, right? So it really is trying to help all of the different stakeholders in the organization responsible to think about all the future needs of the organization and the level of detail to report in order to come up with the data model today, even if you don't build out the entire ecosystem, over the next couple of years.
Yeah, exactly. So here's just a little bit of another view of the maturity that I think most companies are here on the left. You're just trying to track things, report on them. What is happening? Like, I just need to get a number out. Obviously, we want to move more towards managing that. So how am I looking at that, actually creating an optimal plan, using data, using different scenarios, and then getting all the way into how am I driving a more top-line view, which I think is a little bit farther away, meaning I think people look at how would I make more money by being decarbonized, et cetera. But again, it's going to start bleeding into your brand, into preferences, and as we evolve, it will start to be a choice between different companies based on how compliant or non-compliant you are. So, but that means you have to have very advanced AI data so you can actually permutate on what-if analysis from a business perspective, from an acquisition perspective, a divestiture. As you're looking at those decisions, that requires a lot of analysis, a lot of data to get there. And so I think the first solution, of which I'm sure you guys will hear a lot about here at the conference, is really the data platform becomes the heart and soul of a lot of this. And so really focusing some energy on getting this right is important. And that's all the way from the things you're doing to ingest data, making sure you have more modernized, scalable, flexible ways to ingest data into a data lake, that you're taking advantage of things like data models. So there's going to be, and this is things we focus on, is how do we create an industry standard model so every company isn't inventing that for the first time, because regulators are going to ask everybody for the same type of report. It's like accounting, so you shouldn't be reinventing this. There should be things you're taking advantage of. There's rules engines that again, should be standardized to help create those calculations, but should also be flexible. There's reporting capabilities you need. There's going to be AI and generative AI capabilities. Things like data services. Not only are you going to be subscribing to data from third parties that are giving you the calculations, giving you data sets that you need to compare against industry benchmarks, but you're going to be providing data. Your company's going to, maybe you're a supplier and you have to provide your data set to somebody who's buying your product. Therefore, you need a data service that's easy for them to access, and it's not the manual, send them the file every month, unscalable type of need. So getting this kind of core platform correct is key, and everything will build off of that. So starting here is important. As you look at this across kind of the architecture diagram, and I won't drain all of this, I mean, this is how it starts to look in the typical data lake reporting diagrams we all see and are very familiar with. As you have your data sources on the left here, and as one thing to note, obviously all the great data products Google has, the data flows and data plexes, et cetera, in the middle, and many more. As you notice in the top, they're going to be kind of different marts or lakes that you create. So one may be more focused on decarbonization, another more focused on human capital, as Justin talked about, what diversity and inclusion efforts or working environments. And so there'll be some sub-segments of data lakes, of rules, analytics, regulations that are being applied to each of these things. But it's important that you do look at the common metadata, some common company assets that are used, so you have consistency across those things. And then as you get into report, generation, it's not going to be just as easy as, oh, generate a report off the application. There's going to be, back to Justin said, audit requirements, controls, like, is that report really accurate? And how do I know it was accurate versus it was just kind of something my organization felt that I'm on top of? So there's going to be a higher level scrutiny, just like with any kind of accounting system there. So this is a bit of a view on the data platform. And then, Justin, you want to talk about just a real life environment of a client of ours that kind of incorporated this kind of architecture.
So many companies, I would suspect in this room, someone within your sustainability team or your ESG team has said, we got to go, produce some reports, right? That around, let's say, climate or carbon, and they probably looked at a number of vendors. We have like 10 different versions of this slide, depending on what tools they're using for the calculator, right? Workday, Salesforce, Sphera, right? There's a number of different, Workiva. There's a number of different tools that you can put in the right box. And in this client, they were using Workday to do part of the calculation at the end. But in almost all cases where companies kind of starting at that end and thinking, what is that reporting engine or that core calculation engine? The process upstream to get the quality of data to put in and organized and all be aligned on what that data means and that we could support it under audit that we're putting in here is still a big gap. So in this case, the client had implemented, the back end, they implemented Workday, and we came in with their Google Cloud, customer. We came in and built a data hub with Google on the front end, which is actually where 90% of the time was spent, right? It was organizing all this information, trying to collect it, validate it, cleanse it, et cetera. Because I guarantee you, again, back to my point earlier, carbon data does not come necessarily at the right level of detail that you need at the time you need, et cetera. So there is a lot of cleansing and organizing and aggregating that needs to happen, in this spot. So what would be interesting for you, I think, in your organization is understand, how are we developing the data for our sustainability reports today? Are we looking at other vendors? What are we planning to do to be compliant with those regulations I mentioned, right? If you mention any, you probably say CSRD in Europe and the SEC proposals, which we're aware of, and starting to get ahead of this discussion. The benefit of this type of model, again, regardless of the vendors, is it's flexible and basically agnostic to the other tools in the ecosystem. So whether you're, any of the ERP systems, right? Your SAP, Oracle, or any other tool in the ERP side, this can kind of be the solution in the middle that consumes that data and spits it to whatever the number of vendors are that your companies are selecting to different parts. So one version we showed here, but we could have showed you 10 other ones with different vendors, with GCP still being that kind of data hub in the middle as an anchor.
So I think the next aspect of this is reporting. So Justin mentioned Looker, obviously Google's reporting capability and tool. These are the types of analytics and reports that you're going to need to generate around scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So what are my emissions across internal and my supplier ecosystem? Things like my brand health, supplier diversity, pathways. Like how am I getting there? How am I getting to this plan? And what's the justifiable reason I think that's achievable? Investment opportunities, mitigation strategies. So there's going to be various aspects of analytics that are going to be required. And this is just an example of, again, there's tons of versions of these available. But if you have, for example, a spend and risk categorization of reporting categories, maybe you have 15 categories you're going to report, you can start to look at charts. This is an example of breakdowns of where you're spending the most. You can look at, per $1,000 spent or per $1 million of revenue, what are my emissions as an organization? Am I seeing that go the right way? What are my biggest areas of spend? Even benchmark comparisons. So in these categories, for example, I maybe have six areas that are above the benchmark. So I need to maybe address those and at least at minimum get my organization down to a benchmark level as you progress through a maturity curve.
So this was pretty cool. There's this concept of scope 3 emissions, which at a sustainability summit later this year, there will be like multiple hours of presentation. So, and that's to ESG professionals, so we will not drain that. But the punchline is there is pressure not only to report on the four walls of our company, right? And I'm gonna stick with the climate and carbon example and like what we produce in our factories, et cetera. But what about our entire supply chain? Okay, right? If I'm consuming pieces from suppliers that are really bad from a emissions perspective or a workforce conditions perspective, et cetera, that generates supply chain risk. And a lot of companies are moving towards setting goals around scope 3 and supply chain. So again, back to the reason like the GCP, componentry was so important was a lot of the data collected was also from our suppliers and all these different formats and companies, et cetera. And once we had it in there and organized, it was really easy, as you guys know if you've used Looker, et cetera, to build these different dashboards and cuts and say, who are our highest risk suppliers? If we want to stick with this goal to reduce our emissions by 2030, 2025, et cetera, do we go squeeze these suppliers because they're creating a lot of emissions in our supply chain? And a lot of large companies, some of them publicly stated this, are working with their suppliers to do that. And a lot of companies are working within their procurement functions to consider this stuff. So again, just another really good example of using Google Stack to be able to drive insights into supply chain risk, et cetera, to support procurement function as well as the broader organization.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think to pivot on that, the hot topic of everybody's mind right now is in generative AI. And when you look at generative AI applied to this space and the things you can start to assess and analyze and how does it help you wrap your mind around the challenges you're facing here, and planning, when you're thinking about the options, how do I get to net zero by 2040, 2050, and look at the pathways, look at, as Justin said, what's generating my biggest problems or challenges, what are the options that I can take advantage of from different energy sources, et cetera. There's a huge planning aspect there. There's regulatory disclosure management. So now I need to look at all of these new regulations coming out and get my mind wrapped around what does that mean for my organization? I have a policy. Does that policy now need to change? Is that good for me, bad for me? So there's ways in which you can use generative AI to more quickly assess, summarize, rationalize those things. And then from a data management is another space. As Justin said, you have all of this inconsistent data coming in. How do you use generative AI to rationalize it, correlate it together, determine where you have gaps? So many different ways in which this can be used, and just things we've already been playing around with and trialing to see how well does this work is a little bit of a solution around asking questions, to a quote AI environment specialist bot, so to speak. And as you would ask these questions, what's this? What are the order of projects for a particular site? Let's say it's a manufacturing facility or a distribution facility. What order would I execute projects in order to reach a certain goal? So you can start asking it questions, and it would come through and say, here's some examples, the projects and the order in which you would execute those, or which projects need the most capex. I'm strapped with cash, and what's going to strain me the most. So you can start to look at those. You could look at which ones reduce carbon the most, and I could look at that. But then if you're saying, well, I want more of a cost benefit, which one is the least amount of spend for the lowest, the highest amount of input or result? What's the ratio between that? So now I have this highest ratio project, which is the best cost benefit option for me to potentially tackle as organization. So these are just the ways in which, again, users can start to interact with this data, plan, inspect it, and think about this in a more iterative fashion. So another space to look at is prediction and optimization. So I think everybody's seen the prediction boom, and when you're looking at things like weather, energy usage, product demand, service demand, that goes into a lot of how you plan your supply chain, your production, et cetera. And so I think one of the important points here is what I think people have ignored a bit is on the optimization. So it's not about, great, I know it's sunny or rainy today. It's like, what are you doing about shipping your product differently? Am I going around the storm? Am I sending it on ground versus air? You're looking at energy usage. How am I looking at power distribution over time? I can predict the needs based on storms, weather, but how am I optimizing that so I'm reducing my carbon footprint as I go forward? And so Vertex AI is obviously Google's amazing AI platform. They actually have their OR2 operational research tools, and these are really meant for the optimization space. They're very specific for that. And the combination of those two things is a really powerful thing to apply to your organization, because this gets you the predictive, that gets you the prescriptive. Like, what do you actually need to do on a day-to-day basis, quarterly, monthly basis to improve those things? And I think one of the final categories we'll touch on is around digital twins. So many organizations may be embarking on this space. And digital twins can represent a version of your product, a version of a factory, a supply chain, a vehicle energy grid, et cetera. And the intention in terms of how it relates to a decarbonization situation may be, if you're creating a product and you're an R&D and you have to produce a physical version of that to test, does it work? Is it usable? Does it function? That's iterations that you go through. If you could do that digitally and find some mistakes or optimizations first before you start producing those physical versions, that's saving, that's decarbonization. Same thing with another company we're talking to is like hydrogen. If you're looking at hydrogen energy and you look at an infrastructure of what a energy company is dealing with in New York City, for example, like there's a whole plan that's very delicate to balance the grid, the existing infrastructure. Where can they run things? Where would gas lines break because they're 50 years old? And so having a digital version so that they can iterate on that to get to what an optimal, best cost benefit, lowest risk scenario would be, versus actually having to go out in the field and try to do that in today's world. So that many ways in which these kind of digital representations of businesses are going to help companies iterate and decarbonize on a much faster scale. So with that, we're kind of coming close to the end. The last guessing came here. Maybe we'll go over on this side. Is some swag here around which is more decarbonized, the sweatshirt, hoodie, type of gear, or a Bluetooth speaker, and like which one would have more carbon emissions? All right, I'm gonna go here in the front. You're thinking that the sweatshirt is more? So just barely, a little bit more on the sweatshirt swag. So, and again, there's things in terms of recyclable electronics, sustainability-friendly retailers that use organic cotton, other things you can do there to just be aware of. With that, Justin, maybe you want to talk about the last steps here on moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, look, if you take anything away, the regulations are here, and we need better data to do reporting. And if this has not showed up on your doorstep yet, it will, and it may come with a really short timeline that seems almost unmanageable and probably unfair relative to typical, development timelines for this. And that's not negotiable, right, if we're generally public companies. So that's the regulatory component. But the other reason we wanted to show you those other solutions is there's a ton of corporate value beyond just being compliant with regulation, which is really important, right? There's a lot of risk. There's a ton of corporate value to adding better in data and analytics to what your organizations are doing around sustainability. And in most organizations, the twins shall not meet yet, or whatever the expression is. But basically, companies are, data sciences teams are not integrated with the sustainability teams, are not integrated with the reporting teams. A lot of what we're doing is just trying to get everybody in the room together. So without you guys in the room, right, again, to paint a broad brush around technology and data scientists and the teams that kind of lead these platforms, like the business users don't even know what's possible. They don't think about digital twins. They don't think about, they may be excited about Gen AI, but they don't think about how it can actually optimize the decision making. They don't even think about, leveraging, maybe the cloud platform to organize all this information and drive global efficiency. So we really think you guys have the opportunity to be the superheroes in your organization, in the very short term if you haven't been integrated yet. But a couple quick things: get the data platform stood up. Again, there's going to be a lot of selections around vendors. There's going to be, differing needs. Let's get a data model, data platform set up. Let's get with our other business stakeholders. Tell them we're here to help and support. Hey, we heard about this conference. We've been studying. Where can our group add value to your group? I think that's been really good meetings when, technology has met with the business on this topic. And then, there does need to be a framework for, thinking through all of our investments, whether it's the technology investments, the actual projects we're taking. All of this is a big data analytics exercise that you guys can support.
Okay. Well, appreciate everybody's time. Enjoy the conference.